Salve te omnes, and welcome back. In this video, we are going to be going through Aeneid Book 6, lines 450 to 476, translating it into English, going over some of the grammar and stylistic devices that we see, and reflecting on this incredibly sorrowful scene of the final exchange between Aeneas and Dido. Before we begin, as always, let's review our color coding. Anything you see in red indicates a subject. The words in green, I hope we can all recognize, are verbs. And anything showing up in blue is acting as an object in its context. So, with that out of the way, let's get into it. We have now entered into the underworld proper, and Aeneas has been wandering the so-called fields of mourning, the campi lugentes, and seeing various famous characters from mythology who have died on account of love. And that is where we pick up at line 450 with inter quas, amongst these women. Because apparently only women die on account of love? I don't know. Dante had a very different interpretation of that in his Inferno. I think he did it better. But anyway, inter quas Phoenissa, we see a Phoenician woman appear, recensa vulnere, fresh from her wound, and there it is at the end of the line. We are hardly surprised when Dido appears. Erabat silvin magna, she is wandering in a great forest. Quam Troius Heros. Now it's very cool that here Virgil has put Quam and Troius Heros directly next to each other. Also a bit ironic, as we'll see in the next couple of lines, because it takes them being this close together, literally next to each other, practically touching, before Aeneas actually recognizes who it is right there beside him. Now remember, when Aeneas left Carthage, he had done so before Dido actually killed herself, and so Aeneas did not in fact know that she was dead, although to be fair, there were signs. Anyway, next line, ut primum juxta stetit. In fact, the Trojan hero has to stand juxta, directly next to her. The reason we have quam marked here as the object, and not just as the object of a preposition juxta, is because we're reading juxta adverbially here, not as a preposition. Also, quam is going to end up being the object of agnovit, and going with the adjective obscuram down here. But we'll get there in just one moment. The Trojan hero stops right next to her, and as soon as he does that, ut primum, just a reminder too, stetit being in the indicative mood, not in the subjunctive, tells us, in case we didn't know from primum, that we should be reading this ut temporally. So when first, or more commonly rendered as soon as, he stopped next to her, agnovitque per umbras, and he recognized her through the shadows. These are actually shadows. They could be shades. There could be a whole host of shades wandering by as he picks her out of the crowd. But it might just as well be shadows. The emphasis here is on the darkness because, as we see in the next line, she is obscuram. And then, as we scroll down here to bring the next few lines into focus, we see that we are going to get a quick simile here. Qualem primo qui surgere mense aut vidisse putat per nubila lunam. So, qui is technically referring back to our Trojan hero, but really in this simile, it's just standing as someone. It's not anyone particular anymore. Aeneas is like a person who, and then in order to deal with all of this, we have to go to our verbs in the next line. We see someone who videt aut vidisse putat. So even here, there's this sense of we're not 100% sure. Someone who sees or thinks that he saw the moon. Okay, so qualem here is pointing back to obscuram, right? If we draw a little arrow, it's pointing back to obscuram because this is Dido, but she is being compared just as the moon someone sees or thinks that he saw rising. Primo mense, just an ablative of time, at the beginning of the month, per nubila, through the clouds. So Dido is like a wisp of a moon right at the start of the month, that little baby crescent moon, barely visible amidst the clouds or shadows of night. And that is why Aeneas had to get just that close to her and recognized who it was that he was actually seeing. Or maybe Aeneas is just a jerk. However, arguing against that is that as we continue, we see that Aeneas' reaction is immediate. Demisit lacrimas. He sent down tears. So he wept. Dulci quad fatus amor est. And he spoke, ad fatus est, dulci amore, with sweet love. Yes, we do have a bit of an interlocking going on right here with the verb fully rendered with the est in the line, and the dulci amore. So he is wrapped up once more in that sweet love that he says he once felt, even though he had to leave. But we're going to get there in just a moment. Okay, so let's get into what Aeneas actually says. Infelix Dido, right? Unhappy, unfortunate, unlucky Dido. Verus mihi nuntius ergo? So it was a true message or messenger. Nuntius is a masculine. Oftentimes we would say messenger, the person, but here we're probably just going to say the message. It was a true message, therefore, that had come, technically a pluperfect verb here, to me. And then venerat, since we're talking about a message, that is going to drop us into the indirect speech here, which is why we see extinctam and secutam, both perfect passive participles, but indicated as verbs because there's an essay missing. The te is understood as the subject of extinctam and secutam because feminine singular. It was a true message then that came to me that you, extinctam, had died, ferro quextrema secutam, and that you had literally pursued your last things. You had pursued death by means of the sword. Or a bit of metonymy here, iron for sword. You might also argue that this is a bit of a hysteron proteron, right? This putting the second thing first, because he mentions that Dido had perished, extinctam, and then pursued her death with iron. I mean, technically you have to do this part first and then you die. And then we get into this. Funeris heu, tibi causa fui? Ooh, Aeneas. Wrong thing to say. Alas, was I the cause of death for you? Wrong question. And then before we go on to what he says next, let's bring it into focus. Arguably, he makes it worse. Persidera juro. I swear on the stars, or by the stars. Per superos, I swear by the gods above. Et, si qua fides tellure subimast, if any faith, because remember, after si nisi numene, ali takes a holiday. So this qua here with fides is really ali qua fides. If any faith exists beneath the deepest earth, i.e. here in the underworld, invitus regina tuo delitore cessi, unwillingly. Yes, it's an adjective, but we're going to read it as an adverb. O queen, I departed from your shores. To be fair to Aeneas, this does echo what he was saying back in Book 4. He is being consistent that he does not want to leave, but the gods are compelling him to do so. Oh, but he's not done. Sed me iussa deum, quae nunc has ire per umbras. So we start off something about himself and the commands of the gods, again, right, being forced to do it. Deum, of course, is the syncopated deorum, genitive plural. We don't have a verb yet, but we're just going to have to wait for a second. But first we go into this relative clause with quae. So we're talking about the iussa, quae nunc has ire per umbra. So this appears to be referring to the journey that he is currently on, hence nunc, which involves him going through these shades, i.e. going through the underworld. So, and then the next line makes it a little bit clearer. Per loca senta situ cogunt, noctemque profundam. So what we're talking about is we're talking about the orders of the gods, the same ones. We almost want to read this as the same orders of the gods, which are compelling, we're going to read the me here, which are compelling me now to travel through the underworld, to travel through these places which are senta, they are rough, because of situ, because of neglect. This is an ablative of cause. The reason the places are rough is presumably there are no gardeners in the underworld. noctemque profundam, and which compel me to travel through this endless or profound or uttermost night. So we see the tricolon there of umbras loca and noctem, all of the things that he has to travel through. Those same iusa that are making him do this also egere, right? Imperiis egere suis. They drove me from your territory. Egere here is from ago, agere. This is the third person plural perfect tense, using that alternate ere ending instead of erunt. And imperiis suis is naturally an ablative of separation. So once again, it is the gods who are to blame, not me. Nec credere quivi. Indeed, then he goes on to say, I was not capable of believing. Quivi, such a great word. It's an older word that's basically just the same thing as possum. Always fun when it shows up there. I could not believe. That is how this is going to take us down, which is why hunc tantum tibi me, we read me here as the subject, disce su fere dolorem, and fere the infinitive as the verb. I could not believe that I would bring, we would probably want to say, such pain as this, right, this such pain to you by means of my departure. So Aeneas once again explains himself. At least he's, again, being consistent. It's the god's fault. It's not really my fault. I have things to do. And then as we scroll down here and come to the end of his words to Dido, he has a request of her. Siste gradum, hold your step. Te qua spectu ne subtrahe nostro. Do not drag away. We're using this ne as a negative form of creating an imperative, right? Normally it should be noli with an infinitive, but we see this a lot. Ne subtrahe, do not drag away yourself. Don't take yourself away from aspectu nostro, from my gaze, from my sight. Quem fugis, he asks, which is kind of nice, right? Whom are you fleeing? This is a bit of an echo, we might say, of Book 4, when Dido asks essentially the same question to Aeneas. She asks, me fugis? Are you fleeing from me? And here we see it echoed back as Aeneas asks, quem fugis? Whom are you fleeing? And then he says, extremum fato quod tad locor hoc est. There's a little bit of reading we have to do here. This is, so we're going to start down here at the end with hoc est, and that's going to go with extremum. This is the final moment, the final thing, quod, right? And then extremum is going to walk us over to quod, which is now going to be the object. And yes, there appear to be two objects. I'll address that in 1 second. The object here, this is the final thing that I can say to you because of fate, or by fate, or according to fate. Quod and te are both marked blue as objects because I choose to read this as a sort of double object with ad loquor. Quod being the thing that I am saying, and te being the person that I am addressing. I'm not saying that that's necessarily 100% the case. Te might be ablative, but I don't think so, and that's how I read it. So the thing that I am saying and the person to whom I am speaking, this is the final opportunity that I have to speak with you. And with that, Aeneas is done, having literally spoken his last words ever to Dido as fate has accorded. And so, talibus Aeneas ardent et torva tuentum leni bat dictis animum. So we see that Aeneas, by means of these words, talibus and dictis going together, a bit of a hyperbaton, we see that Aeneas has been trying to, this use of the imperfect tense in Latin can often denote, as we know, an ongoing action, but that can frequently be understood to mean an attempt. You're trying to do something, and so you keep doing it. And so here we see Aeneas trying to soothe her mind. We understand, because he's been speaking to Dido, that it's her mind, but her mind is on fire, and not in the good lovey-dovey way, but in the angry way. And her mind is also, and this is interesting, because for tuentem we need to understand Dido herself, that she is watching him, because that's what tuor means, fiercely or grimly, torva, not being understood as an adjective here, but as an adverb in the neuter plural, because it's not describing anything. It's not describing Dido. It's not describing the animum or the lacrimas. Therefore, it's being used adverbially. So, with these words, Aeneas was attempting to soothe her mind, which was burning, and also watching him grimly. Dido was, we understand. Lacrimasque quiebat. And he was raising up, again, we might say, his own tears, which we saw him doing earlier. Now, as we scroll down, we can bring Dido into focus as the subject. Illa solo fixos oculos, aversa tenebat. So we see that Dido has turned away, or she has been turned away. It's not entirely clear, but she has turned away, and she has been holding her eyes fixed upon the earth, solo. Nec magis incepto vultum sermone movetur. Now, in this line with vultum, we are seeing, once again, this Greek accusative, or this accusative of respect, vultum, with the passive-looking verb here, movetur. This is not, we're not reading Dido being moved, which is the common meaning of moveo, right, being affected. But this is a bit more literal because of this internal accusative. She did not any further, right, magis, move her face or change her expression from basically the beginning of his speech, from the sermone incepto. When his speech was begun, her face did not change at all. Nec magis movetur vultum. And then we see what she's being compared to in this quick simile, quam si, as if, dura silex, outstet marpesia cautes. So in classic poetic formula, we are seeing her being compared to a dura silex, hard flint or something like that, rock, or standing there, the Marpesian cautes, the rock cliff of Marpesia. Fun fact, by the way, Marpesia refers to a very specific island in the Aegean where they would quarry marble. So it's very evocative that Dido stands not just as any rock face, but a particularly hard and pale as marble. She stands before Aeneas. But as we scroll down here to the end, it's not actually all bad for her. Tandem corripuit se sat qui nimica refugit. So we do see her gather herself up and take herself away. Corripuit se, right? So she snatches herself away at last. And inimica, because of course she is still inimica towards Aeneas, she refugit, she flees back. Innemus umbriferum, I love that word, umbriferum, into the shade-bearing grove. And then we see that things are actually not terrible for her. Conjunx ubi pristinus illi. We see her previous, her pristine, her ancient husband waiting there for her. We know that Illy is dative. We don't know how it works yet, but we know the situation immediately, right? She is with her husband, Sychaeus, and she's been reunited with him. And so she's running back from Aeneas to the one who actually loved her. And sure enough, what does Sychaeus do? Her pristine, her ancient, her previous husband. He respondet curis. He responds to her with care. That's one way to do it. You could also read this a little bit differently. So what I just did there was I read respondet illi. He responds to her, curis, with care or affection. That is to say, he shows her affection. The other way you might read this is he could be respondet in curis. He could be responding to her pain, and then the illi would be something like a dative of reference with curis. Not really sure that we should prefer one reading over the other. Either one is lovely. I'm just offering them up as differing interpretations of how we're going to read illi and curis. In the one case, curis would be, in my case, the way I read it, he responds to her with love. This would be an ablative of means, whereas if we read it the other way, he responded curis that are illi, so he responds to the concerns or the cares, the worries, the pain that is hers, that is for her. Curis would be the dative with respondet. That is to say, he responds to her concerns, to her pain. Regardless, not something we need to, not a rabbit hole we need to go down. Instead, we can just end, as Virgil does, this scene, aequatque Sychaeus amorem. Sychaeus equals, matches her love with his own. right? So Sychaeus equals the love that she has for him with the love that he has for her. Okay, now as we come down to these final lines, we need to take care in how we read this, lest we think that Aeneas is coming off as a jerk, because it's not an uncommon reading from a modern perspective to look at this passage and read it a certain way, an incorrect way, I will argue, and make it seem that Aeneas is being a bit of a jerk. Nec minus Aeneas casu percussus iniquo. Aeneas has been struck, he has been overwhelmed by the unfair casu, the unfair misfortune. That is to say, the misfortune that Dido has suffered. And Aeneas has been struck by it nec minus, no less, we understand, than Dido. So this line is suggesting that Aeneas understands now the extent of the raw deal that Dido has gotten from the fates. And perhaps he's starting to realize that he has some culpability in that as well. And so he prosequitur lacrimis. He follows them with tears. But notice, he follows them longe. He follows them at a distance. Et miseratur euntem. And he pities her, not the both of them, just Dido. He pities her as she goes. Something to that effect. This, by the way, echoes earlier in Book 6 when Aeneas was reflecting on the fate of those who were not permitted to cross the Styx. We had a very similar situation where Aeneas would stop. He was motus back then instead of percussus, but he also was miseratus back then. And we see him here again, miseratur, having pity, feeling regret, remorse, pain for her. And he does so no less than it's implied perhaps she does, right? Because now Aeneas realizes at the end the full extent of what Dido has gone through. Anyway, it's a lovely scene. It's a rough scene because Dido did get a very, very raw deal, but this is still a touching scene in its own way, and it gives Dido a bit of a happy ending that otherwise we would not have assumed she would have gotten. No one knows exactly what happens in the next life. It's not always the case that lovers are reunited in the Greek or Roman mythology, the underworld, but here Virgil gives us this moment to make us feel a little bit better for Dido, which is fair because, in my opinion, Dido's the best character in the entire story, and we don't get enough of her. Anyway, as far as we are concerned, this is also the end for us because we have come to the end of this particular passage on the AP syllabus, and all that we have left to do is jump 400 lines to the final passage on the AP Latin syllabus in Book 6, the Eulogy for Marcellus, where we're going to get some incredibly wonderful and well-known passages mixed in with some awkward history and blatant propagandizing, but that's what makes Virgil fun. So, as always, I hope this video was of use. Please feel free to leave a like if it was, and as always, maximas gratias et valete.